Sunrises and sunsets are beautiful. There is no denying that, no matter where you live in the world, city, or country. However, if you want to capture this beauty in an image, you may be dissatisfied with how your phone handles it when you point your phone at the sunset and take a picture. It just doesn't look that amazing. So today I'm going to give you tips to improve your sunset photography and allow you to capture that beauty, whether you are photographing it on a smartphone or on a more professional-oriented camera. Let's get to it. Hello, I'm Noah from Anything Cameras, the channel that focuses on helping you improve your filming and photography. And like I said, today it's all about sunrises and sunsets and how it is best to photograph them. Today I'm going to run through 5 steps that will allow you to capture this beauty that I talked about in the intro. So let's get right to them. First, you want to make sure your settings are right. This probably either seems obvious if you are on a dedicated camera with manual settings, or you probably hadn't thought about this if you are on a smartphone where you just tap the screen and take the picture and you are done, no settings to worry about. However, whether you are on this smartphone or this professional camera, you need to pay extra close attention to the settings and know how to set them and how to get your exposure right before you take that photo so that as much detail of that beauty is there in the image to begin with. If you are on a smartphone, consider downloading an app that will grant you manual controls over your aperture, shutter speed, ISO, picture profile, if you have a nice camera and a nice app, and whatever else the app and camera offer. Then there is actually setting the settings, and the most important ones are the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. If you don't know what these are, these control your exposure. They are the 3 elements of the exposure triangle, and you can see the full video about the exposure triangle in the cards above. Now, you may be inclined to have your aperture wide open, your ISO as low as it can go, and turn your shutter speed up however you need to, so that the sun is not too bright and you can take a photo with the full detail in the sky. However, there are a few issues in this attempt. Your ISO intuition was good. You want it as low as it can go, unless you're in extended territory. Chances are your base ISO is 100, 150, or 200. Set it to this. But then there's the shutter speed and aperture. Contrary to what you may be inclined to do, you actually want to increase your aperture, making the iris in your lens smaller, which will make your depth of field deeper, meaning more is in focus. But you don't want to set it too high. A maximum of f8 is generally good. For full-frame cameras, maybe you can go to f11. Or you probably want to do f6.5 or maybe f8 on an APS-C camera. And then there's setting the shutter speed, which you want to set last when taking a sunset photo, and you don't want to set it so that the exposure of the sky is perfect. You actually want to set it so that the sky is a little bit too bright. This will mean that you will be able to recover the highlights in the sky still, assuming you don't set the sky too bright, but you will also have more details in the shadows that you will be able to then lift up in post-processing and be able to see more of the scene instead of a perfectly exposed sky and very dark shadows. Other settings to consider are that you want to be shooting in RAW file format. This will give you the most flexibility in post, which we will talk about soon, allowing you to make the image even more beautiful than when you captured it on camera. And there are also some more settings that you can play around with. However, we are actually going to talk about these a bit later on, and I will explain why when the time comes. The next step is to ensure your composition is good. Now, this is actually kind of a part 1 because there's a bit more about composition we're going to talk about in another step. But by this, I just mean try to follow the basic composition rules, such as rule of thirds and leading lines. Perhaps balance is another one that you can throw in there as well. If you want to learn more about the 5 main composition rules, you can check the video in the cards above. Before we get to tip number 3, please be sure to subscribe and click that bell icon so you know when we post future videos. However, I'm going to move quickly on to step number 3 because it is related, and that is get high or get low. When taking a sunset photo, just taking it from your porch or on the ground is not going to be that spectacular. You need more interest, you need more depth, you need more scale in your image. And getting low will make everything seem big and grand, including the sun itself. Getting high up and taking a photo will make everything seem smaller, and make the viewer of the photo seem like they are the ones who are grand and impressive. This doesn't take away from the beauty of the sunset, however. It simply adds interest to the photo and elicits more feeling from the viewer. Next, consider adding something unique to the image. This could be any number of things, including things that you see commonly. But you do want to add them because just a sunset, even if it's high up or down low, which will definitely add interest, it's kind of just a sunset. And you want to add something a little bit more spectacular in the frame. It doesn't have to even be physical in the frame. There are two things that I like to do besides improve my composition in sunset photos to add interest and add a wow factor. And the first one is taking an HDR photo. HDR stands for high dynamic range. And this simply means that you have a lot of detail in the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows for you to play around with, and this allows you to lift those shadows all the way so that you have full detail there, and decrease the highlights all the way so you have full detail and perfect exposure there. It almost looks unnatural, but that's an almost, because our eyes are just really good at seeing dark and light things at the same time, whereas cameras are a bit more poor, and taking a standard dynamic range photo will make everything seem too dark or too bright. To do this, you want to take bracketed images, which you should even have a setting for in your smartphone app. And this simply takes 3 photos back to back at different exposures. One perfectly exposed for the midtones, kind of a balance between the highlights and the shadows. One too dark so that you have all the detail in the highlights, and one too bright so that you have all the details in the shadows. Then, once you're in post-processing, you can merge these together so that you have all the detail in the highlights, all the detail in the midtones, all the detail in the shadows. The second thing I like to add is a more clear subject. Sure, you have the sun or the view or whatever, but those are generally in the background, and a subject you want to be closer to the foreground. This could be anything you want. This could be the silhouette of a person, it could be a tree, it could be a house, it could even be a car. And though you may be inclined not to take this step because it takes away from the beauty of the sunset and focuses your attention somewhere else, well, while you can do that, you don't always have to do that, because if you stop up your aperture like I recommended, then more is in focus, including the sun generally, and you will have more of a dual subject photo going on, with the sun being one subject and the car or tree, whatever you have in the foreground, being your other subject. This is another thing I talk about in the composition video which I mentioned earlier. Even if it's not a single subject, if you have a more prominent foreground element, such as a field of flowers, some rocks, a stream, a pond, or whatever else, then it will add more depth and more scale to the image. This is especially easy to do if you get down low, like I mentioned earlier. However, if you get up high, you may have a bit of a harder time doing this, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. As I've said, this is more of an optional thing, and instead you could take an HDR, or even just leave it as is. Lastly, you don't want to over-process your sunset photo. This is a very common mistake that I see in sunset photos, where people try to decrease the highlights too much and raise the shadows too much, introducing artifacts into the image. Also, they over-saturate their image because they want the colors to pop, but it ends up being too much. And I could go on and on with how people over-process their images. Editing sunset photos could be a whole nother tutorial for a different day, so today I'm just going to give you the advice not to over-process. Be careful about editing so that you don't get carried away as you're doing it, and maybe show the photo to a third party before you go posting it so that they can say, yeah, that's good, or no, that saturation is too much and it's hurting my eyes. Because you don't want the viewer of the photo to have their eyes hurt, because that is possibly the worst thing that a photographer can do. You know what though, I'm going to throw a bonus tip in here, which is comment down below your tips for sunset photography, because if everyone does that, then it is a bonus tip for you, because you're getting them in the comments below, and if you do that, you're giving tips to other people. So share your knowledge like I've shared mine with you, and take great photos.